Okay. I'm a postdoc at MIT, and today I'll be talking to you about how socioeconomic status in childhood influences exploratory risk-taking and learning. And broadly, my research has really focused on understanding how children learn. And we know from many, many studies that growing up with fewer resources is associated with lower learning and academic achievement. Okay, we're good. Okay, so just to quickly illustrate this point, here I'm showing you 6th grade academic achievement scores plotted against parental socioeconomic status at different schools across the US based on how far or behind the school is in terms of test scores. And what we see is parental socioeconomic status correlates with achievement. So for example, the poorer schools are performing more similarly to 3rd graders, whereas the super wealthier schools are performing more like 9th graders. And there's been a lot of emphasis focusing on how these disparities reflect big differences in what children learn. So for example, children might be getting different levels of enriching input because of differences in school quality or how many conversations they have with adults, stuff like that. And these things might really be driving differences in how much or what children ultimately learn and achieve. But in addition to this, there's also some evidence now that socioeconomic status might also influence how children are learning. And in particular, how children are actively engaging with their environment, which might end up influencing learning outcomes. So in my talk today, I'm going to be focusing on this how. So how do children learn? One way is through exploration and risk-taking. So if you've ever spent time with a child, you'll know they're very, very exploratory. So they explore their physical space a lot more. If you track their eyes, they literally move their eyes around their environment a lot more. They pay attention to not just what's rewarding or relevant in the moment, but also irrelevant information. So they seem to be seeking information. And all of this exploration and risk-taking continues into adolescence and is thought to be this really important mechanism for learning. And in life, we often contrast the benefits of exploring widely that can benefit our future outcomes over exploiting. And exploiting is considered relying on known strategies to get more secure rewards. So for example, taking a familiar class. And because of this, it's more likely to lead to certain immediate reward. So for example, if I take a familiar class, I can probably get a good grade, but this strategy isn't necessarily associated with huge jumps in learning. By contrast, exploring does lead to learning, but there are often these immediate costs and the rewards are less certain. So if I take a new course, there might be a lot of prep that goes into that. I might struggle because the material is new, it takes time away from my usual activities. And not only are there these upfront costs, but also the long-term benefits are much less certain. So maybe I don't like the class, oops. Maybe I don't end up liking the class or it doesn't end up being useful for my future. And if you're growing up with fewer resources, you might be much less protected from these types of everyday costs associated with exploring. And on top of that, if the environment is less controllable or unpredictable, you might have learned that maybe deferred rewards are less certain. And this might lead to very different ways of interacting with the world, which might shape things like learning and achievement. And so the first question I'm going to be asking today is whether poor children take fewer exploratory risks and what this actually means for learning. So to answer these questions, we collected data from a diverse group of children and adolescents, and we needed these adolescents to complete a task where they had to take exploratory risks and learn from their risk-taking. And we also wanted to explore how measures of exploratory risk-taking on this task might influence academic skills. So we needed to collect measures of academic skills. So we partnered with public, private, and charter schools and also used Facebook ads. and flyers to recruit 125 adolescents in the Boston area. And children were between 12 and 14 years of age, which is a time where they take a lot of exploratory risks. So to measure socioeconomic status, we measured parental income and education and combined these to create an index of socioeconomic status. And I'm going to show you what the range of income and education looked like. So here I'm plotting annual parental income, which range from about $4,000 per year to about $1 million per year. And here I'm plotting parental years of education, which also varied a lot. So some participants' parents hadn't completed high school, others had a bachelor degrees or professional degrees. And so we brought these kids into the lab and had them do a computer task that I'm going to break down for you now. So adolescents completed this classic exploratory risk-taking task where they had to balance this desire to secure existing rewards over to continue exploring and seek more rewards, but rewards that were uncertain. And so to play this game, they pumped a balloon on each trial. And each time they pump, the balloon gets bigger and they earn 1 point. But unfortunately, they can't just keep pumping forever and earn unlimited points, because if they pump too far, the balloon actually explodes and they lose all their points for that trial. And so at any point, they can actually secure their points and stop pumping. And so you can imagine at some point, the uncertainty associated with continuing to pump becomes too great and you'll want to secure your points. And so I mentioned this is an exploratory risk-taking task that involves learning, because there's actually these 3 balloon types that pop at different thresholds. So there's a long balloon that pops at a really long threshold, a short balloon that pops at a short threshold, and an unreliable balloon that pops at an unreliable threshold. And I'm not going to share data for these different types of balloons, but the point is that participants actually aren't told about these different thresholds. They have to learn over time through taking risks, through experiencing these explosions, the explosion thresholds of each balloon. So we can measure exploration on this task by how much participants pumped and how many explosions they experienced. We can also measure learning by looking at how many points participants earned in the last phase of the task. So if they're learning, they should end up with more points in the last test phase because they've optimized behavior, they've learned the balloon popping thresholds. So our critical question here is whether socioeconomic status was associated with exploratory risk-taking on this task. And here I'm conceptualizing this as pumping and explosion behavior. So here I'm going to show you socioeconomic status plotted against the average number of pumps participants make before securing points. And what we find is this significant relationship. So children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to pump less and secure points earlier. And this means they're actually sampling less to the balloon's explosion limits. And we find a similar relationship for explosions. So children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds had fewer explosions. So these poorer children were better at securing points, whereas wealthier children had more trials where they actually ended up losing all their points. But because these explosions actually, and the pumping behavior actually served as this critical feedback signal for learning about the balloon's explosion limits, this means that the poorer children are actually getting less feedback about the balloons. And so we were actually curious about how exploratory risk-taking on this task might actually benefit performance later. And so to test this, we looked at exploratory pumping early in the task and reasoned that if this exploratory behavior is actually benefiting learning and providing these learning signals, then early exploration should lead to greater performance later, greater points earned later. And so what I'm showing you here is just how much pumping and explosions people experience early in the task, plotted against points earned later. And what we see is that if you're someone who experiences a lot of explosions early, sampling to the balloon's explosion limits, you actually end up earning more points later in the task. So even though you're losing more upfront, this benefits performance later. And this was the same for pumping, which prospectively predicted better performance. And so given exploratory risk-taking benefited points earned on the task, we next wanted to know whether socioeconomic status on this task was actually related to points earned in the last task phase. And what we end up seeing is, in terms of points, there is this positive relationship. So children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds earn fewer points in the final phase of the task. And so one conclusion we could potentially draw if we didn't think about how children are actively engaging in this task is maybe these differences actually just reflect differences in learning abilities. So for example, the poorer children just aren't learning as well about the balloon explosion relationships. But alternatively, maybe how children are actually engaging in the task is driving the experiences and the feedback they're getting, which ends up explaining what you learn. And this is what we saw, so that there was this mediation where both explosions and pumping behavior accounted for socioeconomic differences in performance. And so I think what this suggests is that by exploring more, the wealthier children are actually getting more feedback about the task structure, which is benefiting their later performance. But they do have to pay this cost up front. And I think this also suggests that maybe if children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds were exploring more on the task, they might actually be learning just as much. And so you'll also remember we collected measures of standardized academic skills, which was basically just a measure of reading, writing, and math abilities based on participants' age and grade. And we were really curious as to whether exploratory behavior on this task might relate to academic outcomes. So the first thing we looked at is just whether socioeconomic status was even related to academic skills. And we found that it was. So those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tended to have lower academic skills. And here 100 is just the population average. So we wanted to know whether risk-taking on this task actually related to these disparities. So I'm going to focus on pumping behavior here because it was a more fine-grained of a measure of risk-taking than explosions, but I'm happy to talk about explosions later. So when we looked at pumping, we found across the sample it did correlate with academic skills. So more pumping correlated with better academic skills across the sample. We were also really curious about how this relationship might differ based on socioeconomic status. So you can imagine that maybe if your environment is already providing a lot of enriching input, how much you explore might matter less. But if your environment is really, really enriching, exploration might be really important. So we divided the sample based on a median split on socioeconomic status and looked at this relationship again. And what we found is that more pumping correlated with better academic skills, more in children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And in fact, pumping was related to academic skills only in children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And I'm happy to talk more about why this might be, but perhaps one possibility is that in these enriching environments, you might already be getting a lot of enrichment. So how you engage might matter less. So this data, I think, underscores that we should be thinking about how socioeconomic status might influence not just what children are learning, but how children are actively engaging in their environments to support their own learning. And in particular, having less might mean exploring less. But despite more limited learning, this might actually be adaptive when resources are scarce. And that's because it secures immediate rewards. And if exploiting and securing rewards is the best strategy when rewards and resources are scarce, then one possibility that I think is interesting is that everyone here, actually adapts their willingness to take exploratory risks based on how much reward is available in their environment at any given moment. And so the next question I'm going to be asking is whether exploratory behavior might actually fluctuate based on the rewards in our environment. And not to add too much, but also I was curious about how brain activity might track reward availability in the environment and how this might differ by socioeconomic status. So to answer this question, I'm using the same cohort of adolescents who completed the last task. And we also needed a task where rewards fluctuated across time, where people are receiving a lot of rewards in some moments, but then very few rewards in other moments. And so we could look at exploratory behavior in these different task phases. And then since we also wanted to explore how the brain tracks these states, we needed to look at brain activity during a task using an fMRI scanner. So we brought these children into the lab, into the fMRI scanner, and you can see it's decorated with a lot of kid-friendly stickers to make it more comfortable for the children, because it is a really intimidating environment if anyone here has done an fMRI before. And we had them do a task where they're experiencing fluctuating rewards. So in this task, participants actually gambled for money by trying to guess the value of a number, and they would win or lose money depending on whether their guess was correct. And so participants were shown a question mark like this on the screen, and were asked to guess whether a subsequent number would be bigger or smaller than 5. Then they saw the number after they guessed, and if they were right, they would be rewarded with positive feedback and were told they'd win $1 at the end of the game. And if they lost, they would receive negative feedback and be told that they would lose 50 cents at the end of the game. So, but in reality, the task was actually rigged. So you might actually have a whole block of trials where you win and you're receiving a lot of rewards with some losses embedded just so people don't know the task is rigged. And you might have a whole other block of trials where you're mostly losing, and these blocks repeat over time, so on and so forth. And so for each trial, we can actually compute what reward state someone is in. And it's basically just equivalent to how much reward people have experienced recently. And so when you plot these reward states across time, you can actually see that reward fluctuates across the task. So in some parts of the task, people have recently received a lot of reward. They're in sort of a state of reward abundance. And in other parts of the task, people have mostly received losses. They're in a state of reward scarcity. And we know from tons of literature that people tend to exploit by repeating previously rewarded actions. So when people are rewarded for certain actions, they tend to exploit this knowledge and repeat that action in the future on the next trial. And so this is considered a form of exploiting because you're relying on your past experience to gain reward rather than exploring another option that hadn't led to a reward. And then in contrast, when something leads to a loss, you're more likely to switch your response and choose a different guess to avoid that action in the future. And so we wanted to know whether people were more likely to exploit or to repeat previously rewarded actions during task phases where rewards were scarce. So the first thing I'm going to do is just show you that people were more likely to repeat previously rewarded choices. So I'm plotting here whether people won or lost on the previous trial and the likelihood of repeating that guess. And what we see is when people win, they are much more likely to repeat that same winning choice relative to when they lost. And this suggests in general, people are securing rewards by repeating rewarded actions. And so now I'm going to show you what this looks like during periods where rewards are scarce versus abundant. And I'm going to focus on what people do after winning, but I can also show you what happens after losing. So when rewards are scarce, what we see is this tendency to exploit really increases. So suddenly people are much more determined to repeat this previously rewarded choice. So if you compare the y-axis, you can see that. And here's what it looks like when rewards are abundant. People are now much less likely to exploit by repeating previously rewarded actions. And in fact, there's no preference for exploiting an action that led to a win relative to a loss. And so this probably seems reasonable because when rewards are really, really abundant in our environment, suddenly the likelihood of getting reward increases. So it's more likely that exploring will actually pay off. But when rewards are really, really scarce, we want to probably secure these rewards because they're super rare. And I think this could also be another potential mechanism that might explain why children from poorer backgrounds tend to exploit more. And I think this also shows that people are constantly tracking the rewards available in their environment and then adapting behavior accordingly. All right, so I mentioned the study was also done in the fMRI scanner. So we also had measures of participants' brain activations while they did this task. And so the last part of my talk, I'm going to show you whether the brain might actually be tracking these fluctuations in reward states across time, and also whether this differs by socioeconomic status. And I think this is an important question because how we track these reward states might actually help us adapt our behavior optimally for our environment. And one candidate brain region that might track these states is the striatum. And this is because this brain region is super, super responsive to rewards. It's implicated in a lot of reward-driven behaviors, like motivation, like exploration, and like risk-taking. And in animals, this brain region actually tracks fluctuations in reward states. And we weren't really sure what to expect in terms of socioeconomic status. On the one hand, perhaps if you're exposed to fewer rewards, your brain might actually be super, super sensitive to them. So maybe you track rewards in your environment more. On the other hand, perhaps your brain becomes less sensitive to rewards if they've been less attainable in the past. So maybe having less means your brain is less likely to track these reward states across time. So what we're doing here, and what I'm going to show you now, is how much the striatum actually tracks these reward states across time. So if it's tracking the reward state, the striatum activity should be higher when the reward state is higher, and lower when the reward state is lower. And what we found is that socioeconomic status was related to how much the striatum is actually tracking these fluctuations across time, where children from higher socioeconomic backgrounds seem to be tracking these states more than those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which I think is interesting and could help us, if this tracking of reward is actually useful for optimizing behavior flexibly, this could have implications for how we adopt more optimal strategies, perhaps choosing to explore more in states where there's more rewards. Okay, so just to sum up, today I showed you that children who were poorer took fewer exploratory risks and secured points earlier. And this actually led to less opportunities for learning and reduced task performance. And I think this data suggests we need to start thinking more about how children might be engaging with their environment differently to produce different learning outcomes. I also showed you we could manipulate exploratory behavior by manipulating environmental rewards. So periods of reward scarcity led to greater exploitation, whereas periods of reward richness produced greater exploration. And this suggests that more rewards and resources in the environment might actually increase the willingness to explore. Finally, I also showed you that being poorer was linked to less reward tracking in the striatum, which might help us think about how we optimize behavior differently across contexts. This is just a QR code. If you're interested in the second paper, you can scan it and see the second set of data I presented. And then finally, thank you so much to my advisor, John Gabrielli, and Julia Leonard and Rachel Romeo, who chose the tasks. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. That's really interesting. So I was just curious. Like I said, two questions. So the first was, just, to what extent do you think of these differences between lower and higher SES kids as being kind of like stable traits that have been sort of formed from the environment, as opposed to potentially variable? I'm thinking of prior work on delay of gratification and other EF tasks that show that in different contexts people perform very differently culturally and in socioeconomic contexts. So I guess I'm wondering about that. And the other question was, I might have missed it, but in the second part of the talk on reward availability, did you see any sort of sensitivity to cumulative reward states as opposed to just what's happened in the short term in this reward phase? And I guess that might be relevant. So are you drawing conclusions about whether there are sort of cumulative effects of experience, or is it really sort of short term effects?
Yeah, both questions are really, really great questions. Sorry, I'm not very good at the mic. Does it sound okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so your first question was whether these effects might be sort of like long lasting or just based on sort of short-term shifts in the environment. So maybe you could be eliciting more exploitative behavior, maybe because that's how you grew up and it generalizes to all sorts of different situations, or alternatively, maybe your context, you just don't have a lot of resources and rewards in your present context. And so you're gonna be exhibiting this, but maybe if your context changed, you would change how you interact with the environment. And I think just based on prior work that have looked at how childhood socioeconomic status affects long-term adult behavior, there is some evidence that this preference for securing rewards does persist into adulthood, even when socioeconomic status improves and changes. But it could be both. So it could be that there might be sort of a set point, but you can also shift around that set point. So in the second study I showed, it seemed like you could actually manipulate how people were behaving based on the rewards they were receiving, which I think is interesting and means that maybe we could shift behavior. Yeah. And then the second question was about cumulative rewards. So we use this like exponential moving average. So we're looking at past history of rewards. I'm not sure what you mean by cumulative rewards.
I guess what I meant just like over that, I wasn't sure because it seemed like in that local reward phase, maybe you're having different sort of things. It's what I thought you were sort of how you were viewing this was based on what happened in the previous trial.
Yeah.
Whether they chose to exploit or explore based on that. And I guess I was wondering about sort of that, whether that's sensitive to over the course of the experiment, how much reward you receive.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so sorry, my phone. Yes, so we measured sort of like over the course of sort of like a long range running average of reward over the course of the past and looked at how that affected exploration like behavior versus exploration. And we do see during periods of higher rewards, people tend to become more exploratory. Yeah.
Hi, that was really interesting. I'm thinking about this from the point of view of the relationship to parents' values. And I don't know if you have the ability to study that at all. And I'm thinking about it also in relationship to the entrepreneurial mindset versus, say, a bureaucratic mindset. Both an entrepreneurial mindset and a bureaucratic mindset could produce high SES, but they would have maybe transmit different values to the children. So I'm wondering to what extent you're able to explore these kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it could be parents pass down values, encouraging their children to think a lot more about their future rather than sort of sacrificing rewards in the present. And that could potentially be something that's sort of passed down that could be reflected in this. We didn't collect any measures other than socioeconomic status about parents, but it's a really interesting.
You didn't collect occupation, right?
We didn't collect occupation, no.
Thank you. I also I love the balloon test. It's such a clever and innovative tool. I know like lots of people here, even as economists who work on this, and I think this is like one of the things I love about this conference is like getting all these ideas for like tools. I had a question about how you think about the magnitude of your results. So in the in the graphs we were presenting for the balloon pumping task, it seemed like, for example, it's going from when you were looking at how many times did you pump or how many explosions did you have, and what did that do to Plato's performance? Like going from 0 to 50 explosions only led to like 2 additional points. If you looked at the slope and the y-axis, like it was like going from 0 to 50 led to 2 additional points in the last round. And so I guess how do you think about the magnitude of the findings?
Yeah, no, I think that like sometimes in these psychological tasks, the magnitude isn't particularly large, but we did see an effect, and it could be in the real world over the course of your lifetime. You're having tons of these experiences and they accumulate across time. So even sort of like a small effect maybe on a task might have large effects over the course of someone's life. So yeah, I acknowledge the effect size isn't huge, but yeah, I still think it's interesting and potentially impactful.
This is really wonderful work. It's great also to see you looking at the Emerge Jordan Rand framework, because I think that's a really great framework, especially the focus on unpredictability. I was wondering if you're aware of a whole area of research that's more in kind of developmental psychology, reinforcement learning, by Philip Frankenhuis and others, where they're trying to actually kind of model, use computer simulation to see precisely how these environmental parameters might shape learning in these settings. Work that's related to that is from Benoit de Courson and Daniel Nettle, and they specifically have this idea of a desperation threshold, where to try and explain all these contradictory findings around risk. And I guess I would see the balloon analog risk task as kind of a risk thing, but I really like the exploit distinction. Anyway, so what they're saying is that you will get greater risk aversion as you're lower in SES or lower in resources until you reach a desperation threshold, in which case it shoots up. It's based on foraging models.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me that you could check that with your data, depending on how poor the people are. You could also fiddle with it in your experimental task too, to see if you suddenly get this change.
Yeah, interesting. There could be some like a U-shaped relationship sort of thing. We did not look at that, but I think it's actually a really interesting question that could fit with these theories for sure. And it is true that in like poorer children, poorer adults tend to, in some scenarios, exhibit higher risk behavior, and in some exhibit lower risk behavior. And it could be sort of related to this present orientation of wanting to secure rewards in the moment. And if that means higher risk, sort of like, payday loans, you might see higher risk behavior.
Or just that at a certain point, the only way you can survive is to
take exactly, risk, yeah.
And then suddenly it shoots up.
Yeah.
Not sure about risk orientation, but
yeah, no, I love that suggestion. Thank you. I'll take a look for sure.
We have like one more question. But we'll have a discussion at the end, so save it.
I'm finding this very thought-provoking and thinking about adolescents' brains. I wonder if there were any controls you needed to put on medication regimes that some of your subjects might be under.
Whether they were on medication during the fMRI?
During their childhood experience, and the formative behavior patterns.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we did collect measures of medication. I didn't incorporate that into this analysis or look at that at all. One thing I'll note is we didn't see any differences between like reported mental health between lower and higher children from socioeconomic backgrounds. So I wouldn't necessarily expect there would be actually like differences in medications across socioeconomic status, but yeah, I mean, are you thinking that like certain medications might make people more impulsive, for example?
Either way,
Yeah.
I'm assuming that you'd like to encourage risk-taking and learning behavior, but perhaps not access to the ADHD diagnosis.
Yes. Yeah.
Area processing.
Yeah, and yes, and that's true. We didn't find any variation in mental health issues across our sample. I didn't incorporate medication per se though. Something we could definitely look at though. Okay, thanks.
Great, yeah.